Yes.
How did you end up choosing that crop?
Well, it was a minor crop compared to the gear, compared to the cowpea, but it was an early, short, maturing crop in hindsight.
What would be the percentage of the farmers, the small farmers particularly, who rely on the seeds of the companies?
If you talk about maize, which is a primary food crop in the maize growing areas, I don't have the latest statistics, but I think you would be talking about between 60 and 70% of the annual seed requirement, or the annual seed planted, is fresh seed of hybrid varieties.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today is a special day for Dhaxalreeb, the Center for Leadership Development. We are interviewing two very important people who have a deep knowledge of Somalia and have been working in Somalia. I have Paul Porter, with whom I have worked in Bonka when our hairs were still black and good to see you in
Good to see
Mogadishu,
you. It's
particularly.
been many years
Many
that we've
yeah.
known each other, yes.
Yeah, and we have also Richard Jones. They are both members of the board of directors of Somali Agricultural Technical Group, and they have been visiting Somalia in the last 20 years, I guess, since the collapse of the government. So it's a pleasure to have them and share with the young Somali agricultural professionals their experience of Somalia. Can I start first with, if you can give your life history?
My life history. In a short time.
Short time, yeah.
Well, thank you, Bafo. It's a pleasure to be with you and see you again.
It's really good.
So I was born in Minnesota, and I grew up in Minnesota, went to college, and got a bachelor's of science degree in chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to be a veterinarian, but I didn't get into vet school. I wasn't smart enough, yes? And so I joined the Peace Corps, which is an American organization that it's volunteer. You go overseas, you live in a foreign culture, and you do whatever task you're sort of assigned. And I was to be a teacher in a high school to teach biology, math, and chemistry. And my location was in Zaire at the time, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I lived there for 2 years in a village without running water, without toilet, except for a latrine, and without electricity. And I taught in a good school and had a wonderful experience. But you can imagine, for an American to live like that and to do that, it was, some would say it's a sacrifice.
Which year was that?
That was 1978 to 1980. And so that was my first African experience back in the 70s. I came back to the United States and I went for a master's and a PhD in agronomy, the study of plants and the soils they grow in, at the University of Illinois, with the idea of going back and using that knowledge, that training in Africa. My desire was to work again and return and travel and see new cultures. And so I was lucky enough to be hired onto the Wyoming team, which was working on a project, the BI project, BRADP, the Bi-Region Agricultural Development Project. And I lived in Baidoa with you from 1986 to 1988. And my specific role was to be the agronomist, to look at crop production, in this case dryland sorghum, some cowpea, some mung bean, and try to figure out ways, based on my training, to do better research. We were trying to do randomized, replicated plots to determine fertility levels, what can benefit crop production. And through some of that research, we made some very significant findings, which are still important today, many years later. And
that's a very interesting work that you did in Bonka. Of course, you were associated with the trials of the mung bean filson, which came out from the screening trials of the legume section, I remember.
yes.
How did you end up choosing that crop?
Well, it was a minor crop compared to the gear, compared to the cowpea.
Yes.
But it was an early, short, maturing crop that is a legume, and so it was important in that it was nutritious to eat, but also it helps the soil a little to grow a legume as compared to a grass. And I personally didn't do that much work with mung bean, and I wasn't the person that identified that specific variety of that we now know of as filson, which came from a different continent, and Richard can talk more about where it came from. But there was a fellow named Adna Soble. You remember him?
Yes.
What an energetic young fellow he was, and I remember a big smile with him sitting in front of mung bean plants in the field, and the picture was taken, and it's in our final report.
So Soble was one of, and there was also another ad, and actually two of them working on the mung beans. Give us an idea of the research climate that was
Yes.
in Bonka and in
Yes.
the country in general.
Yes.
What were the different institutions that were working on research and
Yes.
and how it really functioned?
Yes. I was fortunate to be hired towards the tail end of the project. It was a 15-year project, and I was there for like years 12, 13, 14, 15, in that range. And as part of the project, they would train Somalis at the BS level and master's level, sometimes send them overseas for further training. Otherwise, people were graduating from the Somali National University, the agricultural college out near Afgoy. So there was a research station at Afgoy, and then there was a branch station at Bonkai, and that's where we worked together. And near Bonkai was the extension. So they had a functioning extension service. I wasn't that directly involved with extension because I was more research. And so it was functional, but it also needed improvements. I think I was hired by the Wyoming team specifically because they said, our research results, they're so variable. We can't show significant differences technically through appropriate statistics. We get so much variability. Come, help us. There's something wrong with the soil that's causing all this variability. And I got there and I looked and I had learned about that specific type of soil called a vertisol, and I won't get too technical about vertisols, but they're a fertile soil and they hold water very well and they kind of self-churn. But again, the difficulty of getting good research results, and there must be something wrong with the soil was what my colleagues, the other expats were saying. So it's complicated. This we can't figure this out. And I from my knowledge of what I learned in school, those sorts of soils have high pH, and most likely phosphorus is limiting. But we didn't know that at the time. We knew the pH. There had been soil testing done, but again, so we did a series of studies, and one in particular was a substitution study where you do a complete fertilizer of all the different elements that are important, and you take out one. So each treatment is one less of a complete. And in pots and in the fields, by pots I mean little pots this big, we showed by doing that substitution trial very early that a sorghum plant without fertilizer would put up one little stem. The same time, if it had fertilizer, it would grow faster and bigger, whereas all the other treatments didn't do that. And so right away, we said, well, there's something here. It's a problem is phosphorus. And at the same time, we replicated it with sorghum plants in the field. And mung bean also. And sure enough, we identified fairly early on that one of the problems with the variability in the research results was a deficiency in the soil of phosphorus. But at the same time, we looked around and I looked at the research and I see animals going through the research plots, animals eating some of our plants. Oh, that causes variability. And then I hear, oh yeah, you know, that particular area, that plot, that had some nice big sorghum heads on it. And sometimes people come along and they look at that and they harvest it before we harvest the plot. So that was causing variability. One way that some of those issues were solved was to put up a fence and keep animals away. And so we improved the quality of the research, and that helped. Big effort at trying to look at different sorghum varieties. People came from international research centers, did germplasm collection, CIMMYT in particular. ICRISAT, yes, ICRISAT. And did germplasm collections. My colleague Hussein Mao was involved with that at the time. And but one of the challenges still to this day is we have not really found a sorghum variety that the farmers and the population like more than the local sorghum. We could double the yield by having some hybrid sorghums, by growing some exotic lines, but the traits were not what the people wanted, and to this day, I still think the same type of sorghum is grown there. So,
if you look at how we organized ourselves at Bonka, and you consider the problems that we were supposed to address, what were the accomplishments you think that we have
well,
reached?
You remember we had the 100-hectare farm, which was going to be a model, and it would show how good agricultural practices can increase crop production. And the focus was on more yield, more production per given area of land. And we brought in tractors, and we brought in planters where you could plant the seed, and we planted in rows as compared to the random planting that the traditional farmer uses. And we planted monoculture. And I remember you specifically saying, well, why are we doing this? Is that any better than the random planting with multiple species, with cowpea growing underneath, or mung bean, or groundnut underneath the sorghum? And you did some trials that were influential that showed, you know, that system was very good. But I'll go back to the 100-hectare farm.
Yes, yeah.
We could grow a good crop. Once we figured out the fertility level, we knew best time to plant, and we could do weed control on a large scale with cultivation behind a tractor. We could do it. Why don't you all adopt it? And well, there were lots of reasons it never got adopted. It took quite an infrastructure to get all the equipment there. And we had a farm manager who was from the United States, who was good at fixing the equipment. But it wasn't sustainable in the long run.
What have you done differently?
I remember specifically a colleague, and I won't name names, but a colleague whose attitude was, well, if the silly bastards would just get out of the way, we could show them how to do it.
How did?
And that was totally against my philosophy of I'm working with my counterpart, Abdullahi Genyo, who was my right-hand man.
Yes.
And I was there to help train, and I was learning as much from him as I could contribute towards the situation. But together it was a co-learning, and I think I would have made more of an effort to. I actually asked. I said, "Can I?" My boss at the time, I want to spend time learning the language. I want to learn Somali, and I was told, "Don't do that, because the people you work with need to learn English." And so if I could change, if I could go back in time, I would, when I was younger and had better brain cells, I would try to learn the language. You know, I learned a few words here and there, but not enough in hindsight.
Did you have any relations with CARS, the Central Agricultural Research Station?
I knew they existed, and I knew that they had a soils lab, and we would send soil samples down to them. And when I was initially hired, I was given a contract to put together what it would take to establish a soils lab at Bonskai. And that was when I was still in the United States finishing up my PhD. So I spent time on that, made the document and brought it over, and I showed people here in Somalia, and they said, "Forget that, we're not going to do that. We're not going to duplicate what was done down at Afgwe," which was probably smart, because to run a soils lab takes lots of intellectual capital and money to get the reagents, to get the equipment, and there wasn't a lot of money necessarily to have duplication of services.
The expats that we had in the research station, they were mostly coming from the United States.
On this particular team, the Wyoming team. Wyoming is a state, and it has a university.
So, of course, the two agricultural setups are completely different. How much could we have learned from the U.S. agriculture to apply to Somalia?
I think there are principles that hold across agricultural practices around the world. And we think we're pretty good at being trained on the principles, but you have to adapt that to the local situation. And the science is pretty much the same, but it's adapted to the local environment. And we can learn a lot. We still can learn a lot from what's outside, but we also have to tap the indigenous knowledge. And at the time, farmers knew what they were doing. They knew what they wanted. There were things they could have done better, but there were constraints like weeding, for example. Weeding when the weeds are small, as opposed to when they get too big, it will help whatever crop you're trying to grow. So more timely application of certain principles is important for higher production. The other thing we did not appreciate and still don't appreciate today with sorghum is the fact that it's not just the grain yield on the crookneck head, it's not just the grain, but that stover was vitally important to the livelihoods of people who had animals, and a lot of the population had animals, and/or animals would come through after the harvest was completed.
In addition to the USAID funds, we had also money coming from the World Bank, and through the World Bank, we had connections with the Australian dryland agriculture.
Yes.
We had some expats also working on that area. What do you think was their contribution to the agricultural
You know, the people from Australia came from a continent that has similarities to Somalia. Dryland agriculture, vertisols, the same type of soil. So they could translate their knowledge. In Australia, their climate is more similar to Somalia's climate than in Minnesota. You've been to Minnesota. Have you been there in winter?
Yes.
You get snow that's, this much if you accumulate it during the winter. It's very different. But again, you go back to the basic agronomic principles, the science behind crop production. It's applicable from Minnesota to Somalia, from Australia.
If you remember the technologies that they have introduced, the type of research they were interested in, what had you appreciated in that?
Yeah, there was an effort to do animal traction and use animals because it reduces the human labor. You let the animal do the work, you train the animal. It never worked in Bonka area. Some say it worked up further north near Hargeisa. But the climate is so rough, so hard to keep that animal alive during the Jalal, for example. You have to feed it. It takes a lot of resources. And it ultimately didn't help the production. Even though we tried that, it never was successful and probably never was going to be successful. The only exception is with camel making the, kawawa, I forget the Somali word, making the little buns to help retain moisture in a given small plot. And that seems like a technique that was working then and would still work today. Good. Water management, a huge issue for Somali dryland.
Right. I'll come back to you.
Very good.
Richard, you have been working in Somalia. You've done some studies on the seed sector. Let's start first with your life history, and then your connection with Somalia. When did it start, and how did you see the initial contact with the Somali environment?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm an agronomist by training, and I've spent my whole career living and working in Africa. First starting off in southern Africa in Botswana, which is a very dry, semi-arid climate, very similar to Somalia, working actually with the same crops, sorghum, millet, groundnuts, and cowpeas.
Which years were those?
That was from 1981 till 1987. And I actually lived in a village on the edge of the Okavango Delta. We did have running water, but we didn't have electricity. There was no telephone. The post arrived once a week on a mail truck, and it was a fantastic experience. And my career started when a subject called farming systems research was coming into vogue, because I think for many of the reasons, as Paul has talked about, sort of outsiders coming in and assuming that they know best. I think there was a recognition that a lot of the research that was done hadn't taken into account what farmers know.
Ruthenberg,
David Norman, people like this. So farming systems research was very much trying to first understand what farmers do, and then based upon that understanding, see how you could improve the systems. So from Botswana, I went to, I did my PhD there, and then I went to Malawi as a Rockefeller postdoc and worked with the Malawi maize commodity team. And one of the main areas that we were looking at was soil fertility. Very similar to what Paul has described, we actually did missing nutrient trials because we recognized that mainly the maize, it's a bit of a wetter environment there, was very poor when you didn't use fertilizer. And even when you use the recommended fertilizers, yes, there was an improvement, but it didn't really give the improvement that we needed to justify the input costs. So we started looking at missing nutrients, sulfur, zinc and boron, and tremendous improvements in yield when we address those micronutrients. And actually that led to a change in the fertilizer policy, and the government started introducing sulfur and other nutrients into the fertilizers, which really made me interested in seeing how we could get research results translated into action. You know, scientists like doing research. They do good research. They like to publish their research results. But then they say, well, it's somebody else's problem now. It's up to extension or whatever. And my interest really became into technology exchange. And I started working with ICRISAT, the research center that works on sorghum and millets and cowpeas. And I was based in Kenya. And during that time, we got a request from the European Union to do a study in Somalia. This was in the early 2000s, because the European Union had been giving out a lot of seed assistance in this country. And there was a recognition that a lot of the seed was not actually achieving much. So we flew into Bardera, a colleague of mine called Kate Longley and myself, and we spent about 4 days talking to farmers in and around Bardera. It was a new experience for us because we were met at the airport by a pickup truck with about 10 security guards. When we went out to the field, they fanned out in a group around us to protect us while we talked to farmers. And it was a very relaxed atmosphere, and we had a wonderful week. And we drove to Baidoa, and we spent some time talking to farmers and market traders in Baidoa.
You drove from Bardera to Baidoa?
Baidoa, yes.
By road?
By road, yes.
And that's a unique experience.
Well, it was interesting. About halfway along the road, the farmer stopped us and he said, oh, there's been trouble along this road at night. So our driver, and we had another security car with us, sped up, and it was one of the fastest, dustiest drives I've ever had because we were behind. And you know what it's like on a dirt road, all the dust comes into the car, and we didn't want to let the first car get too far away. So we arrived in Baidoa completely covered in dust from head to toe. But anyway, that was... But in Baidoa, we were able to walk around quite freely, go to the market, and we discovered these women traders sitting in front of barrels of grain, sorghum. We got talking to them, and we realized that actually they were playing a very important role in in providing seed to farmers. So farmers, you know, traditionally keep their own seed.
That was in 2002.
2002, I think, if my memory is correct. So farmers traditionally keep their own seed, but sometimes their fields fail, so they might go to a friend or neighbor and say, look, have you got some seed? And the amount of seed that they need is relatively small compared to the grain requirement that they need for food. And we found out that these women traders were the sorts of people that farmers would go to replenish their seed stocks if they'd lost them. And so we came back and we wrote up our report. We had a Somali colleague with us, Sufi, and I think it got a lot of attention at the time. And it really changed the way that at least the European Union was doing some of their humanitarian assistance.
So what were your main findings in that study?
Well, our main findings were, look, farmers don't lose seed very easily. It takes a lot for farmers to lose seed. And just bringing in seeds from outside really doesn't satisfy the needs of farmers. I think Paul has already mentioned that some of the sorghum research that's being done in Somalia found that it's very difficult to replace a local sorghum variety because of the characteristics that it has. The tight head, which helps protect against bird damage, and of course the importance of fodder. And we always, agronomists, always look at grain yield, but actually, as you've rightly said, the fodder yield is really important. And I think many of these things have been missed in the past. So, based upon that research, then I started getting requests. I was working with ICRISAT based in Nairobi, from some of the NGOs who were working in Somalia. They recognized that ICRISAT worked on the crops that were important here, would come to us, sometimes requests for germplasm to test in Somalia. So I remember providing pigeon pea, which I don't think is still widely grown, groundnuts, and I found out yesterday that groundnuts are being grown here. And ICRISAT is a research center that primarily, but not exclusively, develops improved germplasm. So bringing that material into a country like Somalia, I think, was a very important contribution. And it's interesting to go back and hear stories maybe 20 years later where some of that research is now being put into action through germplasm.
With this, we end the first part of our interview with Paul Porter, and Richard Jones, who are two experts who have worked in Somalia and have got a knowledge of the past and the current situation of agricultural work in Somalia.